Millionaire pays a homeless woman to have his child, but when the baby is born, he's shocked by what happens. Charles Morgan, a reclusive and enigmatic millionaire, stepped out of his luxury car into the chaos of a cold October night in Philadelphia. The city's usual hustle and bustle provided the perfect cover as he made his way through a rundown block. But Charles wasn't here by accident. His sharp eyes were locked on someone, a woman, to be exact. On the other side of the street, huddled under a tattered blanket, was Olivia, a young homeless woman clutching a cardboard sign. "Hungry. Anything helps. I have a proposition for you," Charles said firmly, crouching down to meet her eye level. His crisp suit and polished demeanor stood in stark contrast to her disheveled appearance. Olivia, startled by the sudden approach, instinctively shrank back. Men had approached her before, often with offers that only reinforced her sense of worthlessness. But there was something different about this man. His voice wasn't lecherous, nor was his gaze condescending. It was resolute. He handed her a sleek black business card, the kind you'd expect from a Wall Street executive, with his name embossed in silver and an address printed below. "Come to this address tomorrow morning at 10. Show up, and I promise your life will never be the same." Olivia's fingers trembled as she took the card. Her instincts screamed not to trust him. But as she sat there on the freezing sidewalk, the weight of her circumstances bore down on her. Hunger gnawed at her stomach, and the idea of a way out, any way out, felt impossible to ignore. The next morning, Olivia stood at the address on the card, staring up at a sleek, glass-covered skyscraper. It looked like the kind of place where people wore clothes that cost more than she'd seen in a lifetime. She almost turned back, but the thought of returning to the streets made her feet move forward. Inside, she was escorted to the top floor by a silent assistant, where Charles waited in an office that seemed more like the throne room of a king, with sweeping views of the city below. "I'll get straight to the point," Charles began, his tone as sharp as the tailored lines of his suit. "I need a child, and I want you to be the mother." Olivia froze, the words hanging in the air like a thunderclap. "I'm sorry, what?" "You heard me," he replied, leaning forward slightly. "I'm not looking for a relationship, nor do I want complications. This is a transaction. You carry my child, and I ensure you're compensated enough to restart your life permanently." Her heart pounded as her mind raced. Was he serious? This couldn't be real. Yet his unflinching expression told her otherwise. "Why me?" she managed to ask, her voice barely audible. "Because you have nothing to lose," Charles said bluntly, "and because no one would question an arrangement like this. You're invisible, Olivia, just like I've been, in my own way, invisible." The word stung. He wasn't wrong. How many people had walked past her, never sparing a glance. But this offer, this insane, unimaginable offer, felt like the universe was dangling a lifeline in front of her. Still, what he was asking for wasn't just her time or her body. It was a decision that could change everything about who she was. "How much?" she asked finally, her voice trembling. Charles leaned back in his chair, his lips curving into a faint smile. He named a figure that made her breath catch. It was more money than she'd ever imagined in her wildest dreams. Enough to not just leave the streets, but to rebuild the life she'd lost, her dignity, her hope, everything. Olivia left the skyscraper with a thick contract in her hands and a storm of thoughts in her mind. For the first time in years, she had a sliver of hope, but it came tied to an impossible decision. Meanwhile, Charles watched her leave through his office window. He exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of what he had set in motion. The idea of finally having a child, his child, was a light at the end of a long, dark tunnel. But deep down, something gnawed at him, a whisper of doubt, as if the very foundation of his plan rested on shifting sands. As the night fell over Philadelphia, neither Charles nor Olivia knew what lay ahead. The agreement, so simple on paper, would soon unravel in ways neither of them could have foreseen. Their lives were about to collide in a story of desperation, redemption, and revelations that would shatter everything they thought they knew about themselves and each other. And as the city's restless energy buzzed outside, the first steps of an extraordinary journey had already begun. Charles Morgan had everything money could buy, but the one thing he couldn't purchase was peace of mind. From the outside, he was the epitome of success, a self-made billionaire whose name was synonymous with power and innovation. His skyscrapers dotted city skylines across the country, and his company, Morgan Enterprises, had revolutionized industries. Yet, as he stared out of his sprawling penthouse window overlooking the Philadelphia skyline, Charles felt a gnawing emptiness. This wasn't just about loneliness. It was a haunting, unrelenting void tied to something he had lost, something no amount of wealth could replace. 10 years ago, Charles's life had been very different. He was married to Rachel, the love of his life, and they had been eagerly preparing for the arrival of their first child. Those were his happiest days, his mornings filled with Rachel's laughter, their evenings spent decorating the nursery and dreaming about the future. They had already picked out a name for the baby, Ethan, a name Rachel had always loved. But their dreams shattered in an instant. On a rainy evening, Rachel had gone into early labor while Charles was stuck in a business meeting halfway across the country. A series of complications during delivery had led to a tragedy that Charles could never forgive himself for. By the time he arrived at the hospital, it was too late. Both Rachel and their unborn child were gone. That night had marked the beginning of Charles's descent into emotional isolation. The man who had once been vibrant and full of life became cold and calculating. He poured himself into his work, building an empire so vast and unyielding that no one dared question the quiet, haunted man behind it. But the pain never left. It clung to him like a shadow, following him into every boardroom and every lonely dinner at his sprawling mansion. Charles had tried to bury himself in distractions, affairs, material possessions, philanthropic projects, but nothing filled the void. The idea of having a child again was one he had banished from his mind for years. But now, at 48, the ticking clock of mortality had grown louder. Charles knew he couldn't relive the past, but he saw this child as his last chance at redemption. He didn't want to just leave a legacy of wealth behind. He wanted a piece of himself to carry on, something pure to prove that his life hadn't been consumed entirely by loss and ambition. Yet, he had no desire to remarry or open himself to vulnerability again. The idea of emotional intimacy terrified him. It was far easier to control a transaction than to risk another heartbreak. The decision to approach Olivia wasn't random. Over the years, Charles had developed a habit of driving through the city's poorer neighborhoods late at night. It was a strange ritual he never explained to anyone, not even to himself. Perhaps it was guilt. Perhaps it was his way of reconnecting with humanity, to remind himself of the world beyond his ivory tower. When he saw Olivia, shivering under that tattered blanket, something clicked. She wasn't just another face in the crowd. There was a defiance in her, a quiet strength in the way she held herself despite the circumstances. She wasn't begging or demanding pity. She was surviving. To Charles, she represented a paradox. She had nothing, yet she was still there, enduring. That resilience resonated with him. And for reasons he couldn't fully articulate, he felt she was the one. She could carry the life he had always longed for. Charles's motivations weren't purely altruistic, though. There was a darker layer to his decision, one he wouldn't even admit to himself. Part of him wanted to prove that he could control the situation, that he could rewrite the tragedy of his past on his own terms. If Rachel and Ethan were taken from him by forces beyond his control, then this time, he would dictate the outcome. But even as he finalized the contract and set his plan into motion, doubts crept in. Late at night, he found himself staring at Rachel's old photographs, the ones he couldn't bring himself to throw away. Her smile seemed to ask him questions he didn't want to answer. Was this truly about redemption, or was it another selfish attempt to fill the void? Charles didn't know the answer. All he knew was that he couldn't continue living the way he had been. The pain had turned into an ache so constant that it felt like a part of him. And maybe, just maybe, bringing a new life into the world would finally silence it. But life has a way of defying even the best-laid plans. And while Charles believed he was in control of everything, the chain of events he had set in motion was about to upend his carefully constructed world in ways he could never imagine. For Olivia Bennett, life had been a series of sharp turns and dead ends. As she sat in her tiny rented room, staring at the contract Charles Morgan had handed her, memories of the life she'd lost came rushing back. The clean, corporate font on the page felt alien, as though it belonged to someone else's story. But now, this paper represented something Olivia had stopped believing in years ago, a second chance. Olivia hadn't always been homeless. Just 6 years earlier, she had been a young woman with a future as bright as her smile. Born and raised in West Philadelphia, Olivia was a middle child in a working-class family. Her father, a mechanic, and her mother, a part-time nurse, had worked tirelessly to give their 3 children a better life. And for a while, it seemed Olivia was on track to achieve just that. She had been the first in her family to go to college, earning a partial scholarship to study social work. Helping people was all she had ever wanted to do. Her professors often praised her empathy and determination, and her friends joked that her heart was too big for her own good. But life has a cruel way of testing even the strongest hearts. In her junior year, tragedy struck when her father suffered a fatal heart attack. The loss devastated her family, leaving Olivia and her mother scrambling to keep things together. Medical bills drained what little savings they had, and with 2 younger siblings still in school, Olivia had no choice but to drop out of college and take on multiple jobs. She worked days as a cashier and nights cleaning offices, sacrificing her dreams to keep her family afloat. For a while, it worked. But when her mother was diagnosed with an aggressive form of cancer a year later, everything unraveled. Olivia spent months fighting for her mother's life, battling hospitals and insurance companies, only to lose her in the end. By the time her mother passed, the family home was gone, sold to pay off debts. Her siblings moved in with relatives, but Olivia, now 25 and drowning in grief, refused to burden anyone else. With nowhere to go and no safety net, she found herself on the streets. The years that followed were a blur of hardship and survival. Olivia learned quickly that the world didn't care about her kind heart or her dreams. Shelters were overcrowded, jobs were scarce, and every day felt like a battle just to stay alive. She became invisible to the world around her. People avoided her gaze on the subway. Store clerks watched her like a hawk when she walked in, clutching a few crumpled bills. Even those who offered her spare change rarely looked her in the eye. The loneliness was suffocating. Yet, Olivia refused to give up entirely. She volunteered at soup kitchens when she could, determined to keep some part of her old self alive. She read books from public libraries, clinging to the hope that knowledge might one day be her way out. But as the months turned into years, hope became harder to hold on to. When Charles Morgan approached her on that cold October night, Olivia didn't know what to think. She had heard plenty of empty promises and dangerous offers before. Men in suits didn't stop for women like her unless they wanted something. But there was something different about Charles. His eyes weren't filled with pity or lust. They were filled with something she couldn't quite place. Even now, as she stared at the contract, she couldn't fully grasp why he had chosen her. She reread the clauses over and over. A child for money. No strings attached. The sum he offered was staggering. Enough to rebuild her life 10 times over. Enough to rent an apartment, go back to school, and maybe even help her siblings. But the decision wasn't as simple as it seemed. This wasn't just about money or survival. Accepting his offer meant carrying a life inside her. It meant giving up a part of herself to someone she barely knew. Olivia closed her eyes, trying to silence the storm of emotions within her. Was this desperation speaking, or was it hope? She thought about her parents, about the sacrifices they had made for her. She thought about the life she had dreamed of before everything fell apart. Could this be a way to reclaim it? By the time morning came, Olivia had made her decision. She signed the contract with a shaky hand, sealing her fate. For the first time in years, she felt a flicker of control over her life, a chance to rewrite her story. But as she handed the contract back to Charles that afternoon, a strange unease settled in her chest. His expression was calm, almost too calm, as if he had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times. She couldn't help but wonder, was she stepping into an opportunity or a trap? Unbeknownst to Olivia, the choice she had just made would set off a chain of events that neither she nor Charles could have predicted. What seemed like a simple agreement, a child in exchange for money, would soon spiral into something far more complicated, forcing them both to confront their past, their choices, and the unexpected bond forming between them. From the moment Olivia signed the contract, her life changed in ways she couldn't have imagined. For years, she had drifted through Philadelphia as a ghost, unseen and unheard. But now, she was thrust into the orbit of one of the city's most powerful men. Charles, true to his word, moved quickly. Within hours of their agreement, Olivia found herself in a hotel suite that felt more like a palace. The sprawling space was equipped with marble floors, plush furniture, and a view of the city that seemed to stretch into forever. A far cry from the damp shelter she had slept in the night before. But as luxurious as it was, the suite felt less like a home and more like a gilded cage. Every corner of the room reminded her of the enormous weight of her decision. It wasn't just the money. It was a life growing inside her, a life she would eventually have to part with. Charles, for his part, treated the arrangement with clinical precision. He had hired an entire team to oversee Olivia's health and comfort, from private doctors to nutritionists, and even a personal assistant, to ensure she had everything she needed. He visited occasionally, always brief and businesslike, his tone formal and distant. At first, Olivia found his cold demeanor unsettling. She had expected him to at least show some curiosity about her, or perhaps about the child she would be carrying. But Charles seemed almost robotic in his interactions, as though he were keeping her at arm's length on purpose. "You'll have access to anything you need," Charles said during one of his visits, handing her a sleek tablet loaded with information about the pregnancy process. "Doctors, counselors, even tutors if you want to study again. Whatever it takes to make this as smooth as possible." His words were practical, even generous, but they lacked warmth. Olivia couldn't help but wonder if he cared at all about the baby, or if this was just another transaction to him. Despite the strange dynamic between them, Olivia found herself adjusting to the new routine. For the first time in years, she didn't have to worry about where her next meal would come from, or whether she would find a safe place to sleep. Yet, the transition wasn't as smooth as she had hoped. She struggled with feelings of guilt and shame, memories of the life she had once dreamed of, and the compromises she was now making. Late at night, lying in the king-size bed of her hotel room, she would stare at the ceiling, questioning if she had made the right choice. It didn't help that the world around her seemed to treat her differently now. The doctors and staff Charles had hired were polite but distant, their interactions tinged with an air of professional detachment. Olivia felt like a project, a task to be managed rather than a person to be cared for. But she also couldn't deny the glimmers of hope she felt. She began to think about what she could do with the money, how she could help her siblings, rebuild her life, and maybe even go back to school. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to imagine a future that wasn't defined by struggle. As the weeks turned into months, Olivia's pregnancy progressed smoothly. The initial awkwardness between her and Charles remained, but there were moments when the cracks in his icy exterior began to show. During one visit, Charles arrived unexpectedly early, catching Olivia as she read a well-worn copy of a book she had borrowed from the hotel's library. He hesitated in the doorway, as though unsure whether to enter. "You like to read?" he asked, breaking the silence. Olivia looked up, surprised by the question. "I used to," she replied cautiously. "Before everything—" Charles nodded, his gaze flickering to the book in her hands. "Rachel loved to read," he said quietly, almost to himself. It was the first time he had mentioned a name. For a moment, Olivia saw something in him she hadn't before, a flicker of vulnerability. But just as quickly as it appeared, it was gone. Charles straightened his posture and changed the subject, retreating back into his usual stoicism. Despite these fleeting moments of connection, their relationship remained strained. Charles's obsession with control became increasingly apparent as he micromanaged every aspect of Olivia's care. From the type of vitamins she took to the brand of water she drank, nothing was left to chance. Olivia couldn't help but feel suffocated by his constant oversight. It wasn't just about the pregnancy anymore. It was about the imbalance of power between them. She was acutely aware that everything she had now, from the clothes on her back to the roof over her head, was because of Charles. "Do you even care about this child?" Olivia asked one day, unable to hold back her frustration. "Or am I just another project to you?" Charles's face hardened at the question, but instead of responding, he walked to the window, staring out at the city below. "It's not that simple," he finally said, his voice quieter than she'd ever heard it. "What's not simple?" Olivia pressed. "You're paying me to have this baby, but you don't act like it matters." Charles turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "It matters more than you think," he said. "But I've learned the hard way that caring too much only leads to pain." His words hung in the air, heavy with a weight Olivia couldn't fully understand. For the first time, she saw that beneath his stoic facade was a man haunted by something he couldn't let go of. Their uneasy partnership continued, both of them bound by the fragile threads of their agreement. But as the baby grew, so did the cracks in the walls they had built around themselves. Neither of them could have known it yet, but the life they were bringing into the world would soon force them to confront not only their past, but also the complex and unexpected connection forming between them. As Olivia entered the second trimester of her pregnancy, the physical and emotional weight of her decision became harder to ignore. Her belly grew, her body transformed, and with it, a connection to the life inside her deepened, a connection she tried desperately to suppress. This wasn't just a contract anymore. It was a living being, one that kicked, stirred, and reminded her every day of what she would soon have to give up. The changes weren't only physical. Olivia found herself caught in the tides of her past, haunted by memories she thought she'd buried. The warm laughter of her mother echoed in her dreams, alongside the ghost of her father's absence. The streets she had once called home, the battles she had fought to survive, all seemed to resurface with startling clarity. But Olivia wasn't the only one haunted by the past. Charles had always kept his emotions tightly locked away, but the pregnancy brought fissures to his carefully constructed facade. He was punctual and precise in his visits, asking questions about Olivia's health, the baby's development, and the minutiae of her daily routine. Yet, behind his professional demeanor, Olivia noticed something deeper, a sadness that lingered in his eyes when he thought no one was looking. One evening, Olivia decided to confront him. They sat in her living room, the Philadelphia skyline twinkling beyond the windows, and the silence between them felt heavier than usual. "You never talk about why you're doing this," Olivia said, her voice soft but direct. Charles didn't respond at first. He stared at the city lights, his jaw tightening. "It's not something I like to talk about," he replied finally. Olivia leaned forward, her curiosity overpowering her caution. "I'm carrying your child, Charles. I think I deserve to know." He hesitated, clearly torn between his instinct for privacy and the weight of her question. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and measured. "Her name was Rachel," he said. "My wife. She wanted a family more than anything in this world." The words hung in the air, each one laced with a pain that Olivia hadn't expected. Over the next few visits, the pieces of Charles's story began to emerge. He and Rachel had been married for 10 years, a picture-perfect couple in the eyes of the world. But behind the glamorous facade, they had struggled with infertility. Years of failed treatments, miscarriages, and heartbreak had taken their toll. "She was everything to me," Charles admitted one day, his voice barely above a whisper. But the miscarriages, they broke her. She became a shell of the person she used to be. Olivia listened, her heart aching for the woman she had never met. She could see the raw vulnerability in Charles's expression, the cracks in his stoic mask. For the first time, she understood that his obsession with control wasn't just about the baby. It was about protecting himself from the devastation he had endured before. When Rachel passed away, Charles paused, swallowing hard. I thought I could bury myself in work, in success, but it wasn't enough. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had failed her. Olivia felt a lump in her throat. She wanted to reach out, to offer comfort, but she wasn't sure how. Instead, she simply said, "This baby. It's not going to replace her, Charles. You know that, right?" "I know," he said, his voice heavy. "But it's the only way I know how to keep her dream alive." Charles's vulnerability had a profound effect on Olivia. For the first time, she began to see him as more than just a cold, calculating businessman who had orchestrated this deal. He was a man carrying a deep wound, one that had shaped every decision he made. But the more she learned about his past, the more Olivia began to question her own choices. She had entered into this agreement for survival, for a chance at a better life. Yet now, she found herself emotionally entangled in a situation far more complex than she had anticipated. The baby became the focal point of their fragile connection. Each ultrasound, each doctor's visit, seemed to bring them closer together, even as they tried to maintain their emotional distance. One afternoon, during a routine checkup, the doctor let them hear the baby's heartbeat. The steady, rhythmic sound filled the room, and for a moment, neither Olivia nor Charles could speak. "It's strong," the doctor said with a smile. Charles's eyes met Olivia's, and in that moment, she saw something she hadn't expected. Hope. It was fleeting, but it was there, and it made her wonder if this child could truly be a bridge between them. Yet, with every step forward, shadows of doubt crept closer. Olivia began to notice inconsistencies in Charles's story. He spoke of Rachel with reverence, but there were moments when his tone shifted, when his guilt seemed to spill over into something darker. And then there was the contract. The cold, legal language of their agreement haunted Olivia, a stark reminder of the transactional nature of their arrangement. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was something Charles wasn't telling her, something buried beneath his grief and determination. The more Olivia pondered, the more she realized how little she truly knew about the man whose child she was carrying. Charles Morgan was a puzzle, and every answer seemed to lead to more questions. As the pregnancy progressed, the stakes grew higher. Olivia and Charles were no longer just two strangers bound by a contract. They were two broken people navigating a labyrinth of pain, hope, and secrets. And while they both clung to the idea that the baby would be their salvation, neither of them could predict the storm that was about to break. The past, it seemed, wasn't content to stay buried. As Olivia entered her third trimester, the tension between her and Charles reached a boiling point. The months of restrained civility and controlled interactions were beginning to show their wear. Olivia felt like she was walking a tightrope, balancing the growing bond she felt with the baby against the unrelenting weight of the contract and the complicated emotions she had developed toward Charles. The pregnancy had changed Olivia in ways she hadn't expected. What began as a desperate attempt to escape the streets and secure her future had evolved into something far more personal. She couldn't deny the maternal instinct stirring within her, nor could she ignore the subtle but growing connection she felt with Charles. Yet, every glance at the sterile black and white terms of the contract reminded her of the reality. This baby wasn't hers to keep. Charles, on the other hand, was becoming harder to read. His visits became more frequent, and while he still maintained his professional distance, Olivia began to notice cracks in his stoic facade. He seemed restless, distracted, his eyes often lingering on her for a moment too long, as if he was searching for something he couldn't quite articulate. One evening, after an ultrasound appointment, Charles suggested they have dinner together. It was an uncharacteristic gesture, and Olivia hesitated before agreeing. They dined at a high-end restaurant, a far cry from the greasy takeout meals Olivia had grown accustomed to during her years on the streets. Over the course of the meal, Charles seemed unusually candid. He talked about his upbringing, about his parents' relentless pursuit of success, and the pressure he had always felt to meet their impossibly high standards. "They taught me to see emotions as a weakness," he admitted, swirling the wine in his glass. "Every decision I've made has been calculated and measured. I thought it was the only way to succeed." Olivia looked at him, her skepticism softening. "And what about now?" she asked. Charles hesitated, his gaze dropping to the table. "Now I'm not so sure," he said quietly. For a moment, the guarded walls between them seemed to lower. Olivia found herself opening up as well, sharing stories of her family, the circumstances that had led her to homelessness, and the guilt she carried for the things she had done to survive. Their conversation carried a strange intimacy, a tentative understanding that neither of them had expected. But just as quickly as the moment had come, it passed. By the time they left the restaurant, Charles had retreated back into his usual formality, and Olivia was left wondering if she had imagined the connection they had shared. As the weeks passed, Olivia began to notice things that didn't quite add up. A chance comment from Clara, her assigned assistant, hinted at gaps in Charles's story about Rachel. Documents left in the apartment revealed financial transactions tied to organizations Olivia didn't recognize. And then there was a locked drawer in Charles's office, one he always seemed to steer her away from during his visits. Her curiosity soon turned into suspicion. Olivia started piecing together the fragments of Charles's life, uncovering details that painted a picture far more complicated than the one he had presented. She discovered that Charles's company had faced a major scandal years earlier, one that had been quietly settled out of court. She also learned that Rachel's death wasn't as straightforward as he had claimed. Whispers of an accident, possibly involving another child, lingered in the shadows of online forums and old news clippings. The more she learned, the more Olivia began to question Charles's motivations. Was this child truly about honoring Rachel's dream, or was there something darker at play? Olivia's growing unease reached its peak during a routine meeting with the lawyer who had drafted their contract. As they reviewed the terms, Olivia noticed a clause she hadn't paid attention to before, one that gave Charles full custody of the child without any visitation rights for her. "That's standard, isn't it?" she asked, feigning nonchalance. The lawyer hesitated, his demeanor suddenly guarded. "In this case, yes. Mr. Morgan wanted to ensure there would be no complications down the line." "Complications?" Olivia pressed, her heart pounding. "Emotional attachments," the lawyer clarified, his tone clipped. "It's in everyone's best interest to keep things clean." The words hit Olivia like a slap in the face. She had always known the contract was cold and transactional, but hearing it laid out so bluntly reignited the doubts and fears she had tried to suppress. That night, Olivia confronted Charles during one of his visits. "Why are you doing this?" she demanded, her voice trembling with frustration. "What aren't you telling me?" Charles looked at her, his expression a mix of surprise and irritation. "We've been over this, Olivia. You know why." "No," she shot back. "I know what you've told me, but I don't believe you. Not anymore." Charles's jaw tightened, and for a moment, Olivia thought he might walk away. But instead, he sighed and sank into a chair, rubbing his temples. "It's not just about Rachel," he admitted, his voice strained. "This baby, it's my second chance." "Second chance at what?" Olivia asked, her voice softer now. Charles hesitated, his gaze distant. "At being a father," he said finally. "Rachel was pregnant when she died. It was a car accident. We lost a baby, and I blame myself. I still do." The confession hung heavy in the air, and Olivia felt her anger give way to an overwhelming wave of empathy. For all his flaws, Charles was a man trying to mend a broken part of himself, just as she was. But even as she processed his words, Olivia couldn't shake the feeling that there was more he wasn't telling her. Secrets that could unravel everything they had built. The uneasy truce between them held for now, but both knew it was precarious. As the baby's due date approached, the stakes grew higher and the shadows of their past loomed larger. Neither of them could have anticipated the revelation that was about to come, one that would change everything they thought they knew about themselves, the baby, and each other. The day of the baby's birth arrived with the suddenness of a storm. Olivia had been in labor for over 12 hours, the pain and exhaustion making it feel like time had slowed to a crawl. Every breath she took, every contraction she felt, brought her closer to the moment that would change everything. She had signed the contract, agreed to the terms, but now, as the reality of what was about to happen settled in, she couldn't shake the overwhelming sense of uncertainty. Charles had been by her side for most of the day, standing at the foot of her bed, his hands folded behind his back, his expression unreadable. His presence, though a source of comfort in some ways, had also become a reminder of everything she had come to distrust. She could feel the tension between them, the way his eyes darted to her belly whenever the baby moved, the way he seemed to inch closer to the crib after each contraction. Despite her best efforts to remain detached, Olivia felt the growing weight of their shared history, the secrets, the lies, the betrayals. She had spent months trying to separate herself from the emotional entanglement of this arrangement, but as the baby's first cries echoed through the sterile hospital room, something shifted. Charles stood there, as stiff as ever, watching the doctor place the baby into Olivia's arms. His eyes softened for just a moment, the raw emotion of the moment breaking through his guarded exterior. Olivia's gaze met his, and she saw the flicker of hope in his eyes, the dream he had clung to for so long. But even as he reached out to take a step closer, a strange feeling of dread settled in the pit of her stomach. This moment wasn't the end of their journey. It was the beginning of a new chapter. The nurse stepped forward to clean the baby, and Olivia's mind began to race. She had agreed to give up her rights as a mother, but as she stared down at the fragile life in her arms, she couldn't help but wonder what kind of life this child would have. Would it be filled with love and care, or would it be marked by the same emptiness Olivia had felt in her own childhood? "Isn't she perfect?" Charles said, his voice low, a mixture of awe and something else, something harder to place. Olivia nodded, but inside, her heart felt like it was cracking open. The hours after the birth were a blur. Nurses came and went. The baby was checked and rechecked, and Charles was in constant motion, discussing paperwork, speaking to his lawyer on the phone, making arrangements. Olivia felt increasingly alienated from the process. This wasn't just about handing over a baby anymore. It felt like a transaction, a business deal sealed by blood and sweat. As evening descended, a visitor arrived at the hospital, a woman whom Olivia hadn't seen before, but who carried with her an aura of authority. She was tall, impeccably dressed, her sharp eyes immediately locking onto Olivia. Her name was Eleanor, Charles's personal attorney, a woman who seemed to know far more about Olivia's life than she should. "Mrs. Morgan," Eleanor said, her voice smooth and calculated. "I trust everything is to your liking." Olivia looked up, her brow furrowing in confusion. "Mrs. Morgan?" The attorney smiled coldly. "Yes, Charles's wife, Rachel Morgan." The words hit Olivia like a hammer. She had heard Charles's story about Rachel's death, about the accident, the miscarriage, the heartbreak. But now, with Eleanor's words hanging in the air, a deep, unsettling realization began to settle in. Rachel was alive. "Charles didn't tell you, did he?" Eleanor's voice was soft, almost mocking. "You've been told a story, a carefully crafted lie, about a man grieving his wife, about a dream that never came to fruition. But the truth is much darker." Olivia's pulse quickened, her mind racing as she tried to process what she was hearing. "What do you mean?" Eleanor stepped closer, her heels clicking sharply against the hospital floor. "Rachel didn't die in a car accident. She was never pregnant. The miscarriage, it never happened." Olivia's breath caught in her throat. "But he told me." "Yes, I'm sure he did," Eleanor interrupted, her expression one of thinly veiled amusement. "The truth is, Rachel faked her death. It was all part of a plan to give Charles the life he wanted, without the burden of a failed marriage. The shock of the revelation left Olivia momentarily speechless. How could this be true? She had seen the grief in Charles's eyes, the sorrow he carried with him like a weight. But now, in the cold light of this new information, it was clear that everything had been a lie, a carefully constructed facade built on deception. Eleanor continued. Rachel wanted out. She didn't want the baby, didn't want the life Charles had planned for them. She left him, and in her absence, Charles devised this plan to have a child, to replace what he lost, to rebuild the family he had lost, but this time on his terms. The door to the hospital room opened just then, and Charles stepped inside. His eyes immediately flickered between Olivia and Eleanor, the tension in the room thickening. Olivia could see the change in him, the shift in his demeanor, the tightness in his jaw. It was like a mask had been replaced by something far darker. "What is this?" Charles demanded, his voice low and dangerous. "Don't pretend this is news to you, Charles," Eleanor said with a smirk. "Olivia's just been made aware of the truth. You've been living a lie, and now she knows it." Charles's eyes darted to Olivia, panic flickering for just a moment before he regained control. "Olivia, this isn't what you think." But Olivia could see the cracks in his control. The weight of the deception was too much, and for the first time, she saw the truth about Charles, not as the man who had offered her a way out, but as someone who had orchestrated this whole situation with selfishness and manipulation. "Why?" Olivia whispered, her voice breaking. "Why did you do this?" Charles didn't answer. His gaze dropped to the baby in her arms, and for a moment, it seemed like his carefully constructed world had begun to collapse. But then, just as quickly, he steadied himself. "I did this for us," he said, his voice trembling. "I wanted a family, Olivia. I needed a family. I thought this would fix everything. Fix me." The words hung in the air, empty and hollow. Olivia's heart, which had been so full of uncertainty, now shattered with a clarity she had never known. She wasn't just a surrogate. She wasn't just a means to an end. She was a pawn in a game she hadn't even known was being played. And now, as the truth emerged, everything she had believed about Charles, about herself, and about the baby, everything, was about to change forever. The hospital room felt colder now, the walls pressing in on Olivia as the reality of everything that had just come to light began to settle in. Her hands tightened around the baby, instinctively pulling the fragile life closer, as if to shield it from the storm that had just erupted. Charles stood across from her, his face pale, his eyes flickering between her and Eleanor, a man cornered by the very secrets he had so carefully guarded. Eleanor's presence in the room had only deepened the tension. She seemed to relish the discomfort, watching as the two people she had unwittingly pitted against each other navigated the mess of betrayal and lies that had now surfaced. But the damage was done, the truth was out, and there was no going back. Olivia's mind raced, her thoughts crashing together like a wave of unrelenting force. Every moment of her life had led to this, to the choices she had made, the compromises she had allowed herself to fall into. She had entered this arrangement with Charles, thinking it was a way to secure a future for herself, to escape the unforgiving streets that had defined her existence. But now, she understood, it was never about her. It had always been about Charles's need to rebuild a broken life, a life that he had molded for his own comfort, never considering the consequences for anyone else. Her heart ached for the child in her arms. She wasn't just a vessel for Charles's dreams. She was a mother. And as much as she wanted to believe that she could walk away from this, that she could hand the baby over to a man who had manipulated her at every turn, Olivia knew deep down that it wasn't that simple. She had grown to love this child, to feel its tiny heart beat in tandem with her own. Charles had been standing there, waiting for Olivia to speak, to make the decision he had known would come. But now that the truth had been laid bare, he didn't know what to expect. His earlier mask of control had shattered, leaving only the raw remnants of a man who had been running from his own demons for far too long. "Olivia, please," he finally said, his voice hoarse, pleading. "This isn't what I wanted. You have to believe me. I thought." He cut himself off, as if the words were too much, too tangled in the web of lies he had spun. Olivia looked at him, her eyes hardening. She had seen the cracks in his armor before, but now it was different. Now, she saw him for what he truly was. A man who had used her, used this child, as a means to an end. She had never wanted to be a pawn in anyone's game, but here she was, caught in the web of his manipulation. "You thought what, Charles?" Olivia's voice was steady, though it shook with the weight of emotion she had been trying to suppress. "You thought I wouldn't find out? You thought I would just hand over my baby and walk away, without ever questioning the story you fed me?" Charles's face flushed, his eyes darting to Eleanor for support, but there was none to be found. Eleanor's gaze remained cold, indifferent. This wasn't her fight. She was simply the messenger of a truth that could no longer be ignored. "I didn't want to hurt you," Charles said, his voice breaking. "I never meant to hurt you. I needed this child. For me. For my redemption. I thought that if I could bring this baby into my life, I could fix everything that had gone wrong. I could finally have the family I lost." Olivia's heart twisted with conflicting emotions. She had come to understand, in her own way, what he had been through. The loss of Rachel, the guilt, the loneliness. It was all so painfully human. But none of that could justify what he had done to her, what he had done to this baby. She had spent so many years fighting for survival on the streets, only to find herself tangled in a different kind of struggle now. A battle between truth and lies, love and betrayal. The baby in Olivia's arms shifted slightly, a soft whimper escaping from its tiny mouth. It was as though the child was the one holding the room together, reminding them all of what was truly at stake. The decisions they made in this moment would shape the child's future forever. Olivia's eyes softened as she gazed down at the infant, a surge of protectiveness flooding her chest. Charles saw the change in her, the shift in her resolve. She wasn't the same woman he had manipulated at the beginning of this journey. Olivia had grown stronger, more resolute. She had a heart capable of great love, but also of great strength. "Please," Charles whispered again, his voice fragile. "I need you to understand. I thought I was giving you everything. A future, a family, security." "Security?" Olivia's voice cracked, but she didn't allow herself to break. "You didn't give me security, Charles. You gave me a cage. You didn't give me freedom. You gave me a contract that bound me to you and your lies." The room fell into a heavy silence, the weight of Olivia's words settling over them all. Charles looked away, unable to meet her eyes. His shame was palpable. This was the moment when everything came to a head, the moment of reckoning. Olivia stood, still cradling the baby in her arms. Every instinct within her screamed to leave, to walk away from Charles and take the child with her, to give the baby the life it deserved, free from the corruption of the world Charles had created. But she knew it wasn't that simple. "I won't let you take my baby from me," Olivia said, her voice strong, unwavering. "You've already taken enough." Charles's eyes widened, a flash of panic crossing his face. "Olivia, please," he begged, stepping toward her. "You can't do this. This is what's best for the child. I can give them everything you can't." The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of their finality. Olivia took a deep breath, her decision made. She had been handed a painful truth, one that threatened to break her, but in this moment, she would stand her ground. For herself, for the baby. "No, Charles," Olivia said softly, her voice tinged with finality. "What's best for the child is love. And right now, I'm the only one who can give that." Charles recoiled as if struck, the reality of the situation settling over him like a shroud. Olivia had made her choice, and no amount of pleading, no amount of manipulation could change it now. She wasn't the naive woman he had met months ago. She was a mother, and nothing, not even him, could take that away. With one last look at the man who had tried to control her life, Olivia turned and walked out of the hospital room, her baby in her arms, her heart heavy with the weight of her decision. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear: she would face it on her own terms, and she would protect her child, no matter the cost.